Welcome to JCAT, a program that seeks to introduce Japanese, contextualized literature and ideas for use by missionaries and anyone that seeks to share the gospel with Japanese people.
日本人から聞く日本のキリスト教。
All right, welcome back. I'm here with Chris Payne, who is, I believe, the Japan director of OMF. Is that correct?
Yeah, field director. So for the bit missionaries coming in, we have another director sending out, but yeah, for the missionaries coming in, I'm the field director.
Okay. Oh, I internally I had a little thought. So are you from England? Is that? Or
I am from the UK.
United Kingdom, because it's more than just England, right?
Yeah. But I am from the UK, but I'm also from England. So
okay. So here's just a silly question. Your last name, is that? I was like, okay, I know in history, the French and the English have like back and forth, and I thought that sometimes I see bakeries with your last name and other sort of French.
Right.
Is that am I onto something or no?
Maybe. I don't really know the background, but it could well be that I have French bakers in my ancestry. But
well, no one ever said anything bad about a French baker, I don't think. Anyway, I'm sorry, that's just I like to play around with stuff sometimes. But we were going to talk about something that OMF, is this OMF Japan? This must be OMF Japan specifically.
Yeah, that's right.
Put out a research thing. I have it in book form, a report called Church Planting and Partnering in Japan, Learning from Pastors and Missionaries' Perspectives. And this is something that can be downloaded from the OMF website, which I can link to the either the YouTube or the podcast, wherever people are getting this. And it's a free download, but
in Japanese and English.
Perfect.
And we're working on some other translations, but let's see where we get to.
Okay, yeah. Well, and it's, if you ever get your hands on not you, Chris, but anybody, on a paper, a bound copy, they've got really nice graphs and everything. Well, I'm sure that's in the PDF too, but I like paper stuff. Anyway, would you mind just sort of introducing maybe first the impetus of this report, like what produced this report, and then we can talk more after that?
Yeah. So as OMF, we've always kind of considered ourselves a church planting mission, and we've been doing that since we arrived in Japan in 1950s. When our field leadership team was talking together a few years back about our kind of where's our priorities, what's the work we're going to do for the next 10 years or so, we're like, yeah, we want to be committed to church planting, but we feel like we're at a point where we need to just step back and go, well, how are we doing that? Let's think about what we've done. Let's review it. Praise the Lord, we've seen maybe about 70 churches or so planted, but perhaps haven't seen as many of those go on to plant another church as we would have liked to have seen. And so are there lessons we can learn? But also the landscape's changed. When we arrived in the 1950s and we went up to sort of Aomori and Hokkaido and places, there's very little in terms of churches, particularly evangelical churches at that time. Whereas now these churches that we've planted and that other people have planted. So we really need to make sure that we're thinking, well, how do we work well with Japanese churches? How do we take account of what they're thinking, what their priorities are? So actually we need to kind of step back and just reassess, where's the church in Japan? What's it thinking? What's kind of worked? What's good church planning focus strategy methods in Japan? What are the barriers? How do we do partnerships? So that was the big question. And then we thought, well, actually, let's not just talk about this amongst OMF missionaries. Let's go and interview and talk to some pastors and other leaders in other mission agencies too, and get their perspectives on this. So before we continued the kind of internal strategy discussion, we went away and spent yeah, maybe about 18 months or so doing this research project.
When people look at this, what are they
Yeah.
going to get out of it? Obviously, they're going to read it, they're going to get something out of it. But if you could summarize maybe some of the findings.
Sure. So I guess, I mean, so let me just say a little bit about how we did it so they know like what the research is based on. So we had a online survey kind of questionnaire, which is about 70 odd people took part in. And then we had in-depth interviews, like an hour and a half, maybe slightly longer, with 26 Japanese leaders, about 9 OMF missionaries who've got experience in church planting, and 7 missionaries from other agencies. And we tried to kind of spread them across the country. And so it's sort of the results of that sort of online survey plus the in-depth kind of interviews that we did. And we had a research company called Ado Research based in the UK help us with the analysis, because they're kind of equipped to do a lot of the analysis of all that data that comes out of these interviews and look for the recurring themes and work out which is statistically significant. And then we actually asked them to do the analysis for us too, because we want sort of like a third party kind of neutral, well, what are you seeing here? And we worked a lot with them to help with the kind of cultural interpretation. We had one Japanese pastor on our team, and then quite a lot of experienced missionaries and one of our own members who's Japanese be part of the team to kind of help with the cultural piece and that interpretation, but they were the ones sort of in charge of the data. So you're going to see something which talks about, well, what's the principles for effective church planting in Japan? There's a section which then talks about what are the barriers to effective church planting in Japan. What are the things that we're encountering? What are the ways that we should work together with partners, particularly looking at maybe how missionaries view that versus pastors view that, and then just getting, oh, okay, if we're going to be good partners, we need to understand this other perspective. And then looking at, well, what should missionaries' role be? How do we engage well in future partnerships? And then there's just a few other things, like in the back of this report, we actually started, before we did the interviews, we did a literature review. So we went and read 47, I think it was, different books or articles on church planting in general, but also in Japan specifically. And then we kind of used that to inform what the questions we should ask were. But we've kind of included that in the back of the report too. So if people want to get a kind of, how did we think about this? What are some good resources to go away and read? There's that kind of helpful list in the back of this as well.
Oh wow, that's very cool. Yeah, you're right. There's a number of appendices. Is that how you would pluralize that?
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you. I try. You mentioned some of the, let's see, you mentioned barriers and then maybe how things are done effectively.
Yeah.
What would you, I guess that kind of stood out to me, was the idea that the barriers to working. I know there's the sort of typical barriers when missionaries and pastors work. Maybe the most glaring is just the cultural difference, and then who's in charge. You know what I mean? That's kind of like, oh, the very first thing I can think of. But what were some other things that maybe came up that you found interesting, or that you also mentioned maybe before we hit record that OMF missionaries all went over this, or Japan-based OMF missionaries went over this and then discussed how to benefit from it. So, well, something related to barriers, was that barriers specifically working with the Japanese pastors, or just barriers to church planting in Japan?
Barriers to church planting, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, what were some of the, I mean,
so I guess so the way the report's structured is we sort of identified that, from what, and this is all again based on what pastors and experienced missionaries have been telling us, and but we kind of look at, we need inwardly healthy churches and we need outward focused churches as kind of the big groupings. We've got some more information broken down within those, but what does it take for a church to be inwardly healthy? What does it take to get it outwardly focused? And then looking at methodology And actually the conclusion of this report is, let's be methodologically flexible. Let's not just be tied to one model. There isn't just one model that seems to be working in Japan, but the bigger thing is, well, what's going on in the heart of the church that you're planting, depending on the model. And is the model well matched to the location? Is it well matched to the people that are running it? There's some other stuff on models maybe we can come back to. But so when it comes to barriers, when we were asking like, well, what's the barrier to inward health or internal health of a church? The three kind of top things that were mentioned by the respondents were a lack of believers equipped for service, and kind of related to that, a lack of discipleship. And so there was this sort of interesting discussion around, what are we training and equipping believers towards? And what is the sort of, I don't know, everybody was like, yeah, we share the same biblical kind of function around, disciple somebody who follows Christ. We know that the job of pastors is to equip the saints for works of service, that kind of, Ephesians 4 thing. But actually, when you get down to the detail of what does that mean, are we really aiming for the right things? So one of the things that we've reflected on as OMF is in our own sort of work on this afterwards has been, have we had too much of a focus, and is it too easy to get focused in on knowledge rather than obedience? So discipleship becomes much more about biblical knowledge, which of course is important. Really want people to know their Bibles. But if we're not equally saying, but how are you living that out? How is this impacting every day? We're kind of missing an important dimension. And if our discipleship becomes too focused around Sunday service, again, that's important. We want people to be gathering together, but that isn't the kind of goal or the end of being a disciple. What's that purpose of that gathering together, and how is that feeding into the rest of the week or not? Those are just some of the things that we've been sort of working out. And then also making sure that we're, as leaders, getting out of the way, if you like, so that we're linking people to a relationship with Jesus, and not kind of standing in the way of that. So that's some of the things that we thought about in terms of the believers equipped for service, which was, I say, a common theme that our respondents shared. The decline of the church in Japan was something else that people talked about, and I think, particularly for our brothers and sisters who are applying from outside the big urban centres, they're seeing a lot of people leave. And their local communities getting older. And so that sense of having an internally healthy church when people are physically weak and aging is challenging. And then, and this wasn't directly coming out of the research, but some of the things we've been following up with, well, in the context of the church declining as it is at the moment numerically, how are we going to respond to that? So church planting is one part, church revitalization is another key thing, but also we need to rethink some of our models, some of our thinking. Like some of the things that we've had going on, during the post-Second World War period, sort of, activities and the structures that were built up can't be sustained as numbers drop. So then how will we have those hard conversations about what we stop? Because if we don't stop doing stuff, we won't have energy or capacity to think about doing new things. And if we just try and sustain stuff without being a little bit hard-nosed about whether something should close, we put a lot of energy into just slowing down the death of a ministry or whatever. It's a hard thing to talk about, rather than closing it and using the energy that would have gone into sustaining it for a bit longer to actually produce something new. So those are some of the conversations that sort of flowed out of that for us.
I see.
And
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
So just the last one that came out was which I first found really interested, was a lot of our respondents talked about busyness and perfectionism within the church as being barriers to kind of internal health. And there was this one sort of lovely quote in the report that talked about how we need to really make churches be a place where it's okay to try and fail. The kind of gospel of grace needs to come into that aspect of who we are as churches together. And it talks about one particular church that had 失敗してもいい教会です above the door. You know, like it's a church where it's okay to make mistakes, kind of written large above the door as you go
Oh
in.
wow, that's good. Yeah.
But that sort of idea, and then just a reality of how do we do church within the context of a very busy society? So then thinking again through, well, what's suitable and focused and contextualized for Japan? What are the core things? And what are things which maybe we would be nice to have, but we can't because of, you know, just the reality of how busy people are.
Yeah. Well, you said a number of things that I would love to follow up on, and my brain always gets. So you mentioned that just now about things contextualized for Japan, but before I forget the thing before that that was interesting, I think it's going to relate to the models that you were talking about,
Yeah.
maybe showing up later in the book, but just the idea that, again, when so many of the major missions movement, I guess, happened after World War II, the situation was such that foreign money was worth more at the time. Land was cheaper. It was easier to build uh, church buildings, camps, and a lot of different Christian ministries really were able to sort of launch
Yeah.
in those days. And then since then, you have a lot of, I guess, even a lot of the church buildings that we have in Japan today, even evangelical churches, are probably even from those first, 50s to 70s. But as you mentioned, as the church sort of shrinks, the population shrinks, how can we adjust when we start thinking about those realities that we have pastors that are in their mid 70s, like congregations that are also aging and have a small number to start with. I'm wondering what kind of models maybe you suggested as a result of the research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like I say, I mean, one of the interesting things is that, you know, a lot of the churches that we were interviewing were kind of the result, I guess, of what we might call the traditional model. So, you know, send in a team, establish a base, get a building, call a pastor, hand it over. And so even though that's what a lot of the sort of background to these churches were, the pastors were saying to us, they find the traditional method, you know, pretty intimidating, like beyond their resource, and hard to think about carrying that if you're already pastoring your own church. So a lot of emphasis then on networking together to do church plants, and preferably local networks of churches doing it. That was one of the key things that came out for us, is like, how can we do this together? And that's been important for us as OMF, as we've been thinking and trying to go from, yeah, we are planting churches and handing them over, to actually, well, let's do church plants together from the beginning. And how can we move towards that? And we might have some people who can go and work with a church and provide some resource for, you know, for the early part of the church plan or whatever, and enable them to do something that otherwise they couldn't do, not because they're not willing, but because they just don't have the manpower, or, you know, the people to do it. So that's one thing that we've been thinking about. I think the other thing is just thinking, what's the end goal here? Is it a church with a building and a pastor, or is it a healthy community of believers who can sustain fellowship and keep reaching out? And so actually, what's our end goal? And our end goal isn't necessarily to have, you know, the pastor in the building. Although there's still a lot of value around building and space, you know, and some of our respondents in the survey were saying that's actually really important, that for a church to have a building and a space and kind of be visible breaks down barriers and makes it, although it's hard for people to go into a church building, it's easier than if you just can't see what this organization is at all. So there's some tension there, but I think it's, for us, we've been really going back to that. Well, what's the outcome we're aiming for, as well as how can we do this alongside and with and under the leadership of Japanese churches we're partnering with, rather than sort of starting something and then looking, well, how do we hand it over? Let's do it together from the beginning.
That's fantastic. Can you flesh out the idea that you mentioned of local church networks? Is that like within regions, cities? Is it interdenominational? Is it between missionaries and pastors and Japanese believers, or how does that look like?
Yeah, I think I mean there's different ways that it's been done across Japan, but I know there are some some different networks out there. There's networks that are interdenominational, and there's a lot of there's not necessarily funding going through that network, but it might be, look, if you're wanting to start a church and you've got a plan and a vision for that, we can connect you with 3 or 4 other churches who have also maybe got some experience in doing that, who want to pray for you. You've then got 2 or 3 key relationships with other pastors that you can go to and talk to about it. We can come alongside you with some resources. So Japan Church Planning Network would be one of those. But there are also examples that some of our different respondents have been involved in their local prefecture, where there's churches together saying, okay, let's work for this prefecture or whatever. And then interesting, some of the sort of respondents kind of reflecting on where they've come from in their church planning strategy, which has been, well, let's plant in, say, the key prefectural cities, and then expect that church to get established and then go on to plant from there. And saying, yeah, then in the end, that hasn't worked out as we wanted, because we've just got some churches now really spread quite far apart in these different prefectural cities, and so they haven't gone on to plant yet. So they're actually quite isolated. So actually, can we do more where we're relating together as evangelical churches in the same city? Or even actually, do we go for more incremental, like we've got one church here that's strong and it plants more locally, and then kind of, sort of strawberry plant, sort of church planting, it's sometimes called, you plant within reach, and then keep kind of building like that. So those are some of the reflections. And I think a lot of, the outcome of the research is really, the context of Japan says we need a lot of church planting, and there's room for a lot of different approaches. But let's have some conversations around what that looks like. And then let's be much more willing to partner and not just kind of build our own kingdoms.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to ask you about was, again, discipleship.
Yeah.
So as I think about Japan and Japanese people, we say that Japanese are Shintoists, we say that they're Buddhists, we say that they're nothing. We say, religiously speaking, I don't know any Japanese that go to a temple weekly, or they go to a shrine weekly. Maybe they do the holiday, the seasonal, like the year end and Obon, that kind of thing. So it seems to me that even when Japanese people have a desire to become Christians, weekly services are a new idea for people. We sort of have I guess Christianity sort of has a high bar of discipleship. And that's not to say that we shouldn't have a high bar of discipleship, but I guess how do you address, or do you address that? Or is that like another step in the thing on how to disciple people in this context, I guess?
Yeah.
When seems to be these obstacles.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question. It's not something that's covered, in our research in terms of like how to tackle some of that busyness. It's there as a barrier, and we've got to work out ways. But I think, I mean, some of the things I think I've heard and learned and seen from other people is when you're discipling and when you're evangelizing and you're bringing people into the community, actually helping them see relationships with the church and relationship with Jesus as the kind of thing they see first before you bring them into the organization, if you like. So it's not like, oh, great, now you're seeking, you should come to church every week. It's like, great, now you're seeking, let's get you studying the Bible with somebody and have you have this close relationship. And it's as that kind of those relationships and that community builds, and then hopefully, as the Holy Spirit works in them, and as they're taught from the Word, oh, and I need to start attending regularly, not because that's the rule or the obligation, but because actually I know that that's the thing that's best for me, that God's Word teaches me to do. And actually, I'm also going and meeting these people who I've got to know and value and love, and who help me walk my life daily. Because you're right, people aren't regularly going. Most people aren't regularly going to the temple or to the Shinto shrine, but the conception of those religions, what you need to do compared to a living relationship, is quite different. So helping people grasp that kind of slowly and through relationship, through one-to-one, maybe before you bring them into the institution or the organization of the church. I mean, churches are organized and they do have, rules and behavior, whatever. That's one thing that I think I've seen modeled well by pastors that I've worked with, and that's helped me think about how to do it. Another one I know is just, well, when and how are we going to do discipleship? What does that look like? And I remember talking to, it was a missionary guy I met, and he told me how he built up the elders of his church, and that was getting on the train with them at 6 a.m. as they commuted into Tokyo. And he'd go along with a cup of coffee and an onigiri for them, and they'd sit on the train for the hour and a half or hour into Tokyo and do Bible study on the train. So he's kind of using their time that's kind of dead for them. I mean, great sacrifice from him. But, I look at that church with some of those guys there serving as elders. I think, wow, he was onto something there. So a lot of the ways that we tend to want to do things around, prayer meeting or whatever is just very challenging. When we've been looking at some marketplace related stuff, we're kind of like, yeah, that's going to have to be Saturday night or early Saturday morning, or 10 o'clock at night, even on a weeknight, whatever, just in order to get it at a time where people can come. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts, not from the research at all, but just from things I've observed and learned.
Oh yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I think it shows the point of how much creativity is maybe necessary to make some of this work, which is really cool. The train thing, that whatever works, I guess. And that is a lot of commitment by the discipler in that case. In chapter 7 of the report, that's conclusions and recommendations. We have a number of conclusions and recommendations. I guess when you guys finished this and then you talked about it, what's the way forward?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first recommendation out there is like, let's communicate this kind of research and thinking, because there's this, bunch of really wise people. And we're particularly grateful to the pastors who really gave us their time and wisdom. Let's communicate this, let's share this, which is why we've ended up, getting it published and trying to share it in other ways too. But then, there's a challenge in there. Look, okay, we've identified these barriers. There's not a lot around kind of common solutions, but the barriers are really clear. So how are you going to train and equip your workers to think about that? And so that's something for us we've been, trying to think about some more. We've also taken seriously the sort of, there's no one model approach. And so actually just internally within OMF, we've, whereas in the past, sort of unofficially, I guess, we plant churches using the traditional model, they're going to join a particular group and we hand them over. That's no longer our stance. We may well do that kind of work where it's appropriate, but we've actually tried to think much more about the core values that come out of this research and as who we are as OMF Japan. And then say, look, so long as we're living out those values and they're kind of the core of what we're doing and the sort of the DNA of the church that we're planting, then the method doesn't matter so much. Let's be flexible around those things, but really tight on the core values, the stuff that's essential, the discipleship, and then flexible around the rest. And so trying to, think more about that kind of central values rather than the form. And then encouraging our workers too, because all of us have preferences, I think, around form. We've all got a style of church that we're used to, a style of worship music that we like, a thing that we're just comfortable with. But actually challenging ourselves to go, but that's not what we're aiming for, particularly when we're going into partnerships. If we go in and we've got people with those core values there, but the sort of external expression of those looks quite different. Well, let's embrace that and let's humble ourselves to work with our brothers and sisters who are doing that. And that's easy to say and harder to do, but really wanting to push much more and think much more about partnerships as well has been another result of this, that planting on our own may still be necessary and will still be necessary in certain communities and places, but actually the more we can do together, and the way that we can kind of bring our agenda and bring it actually under what the Japanese churches that we're partnering with are wanting to do. As long as we're seeing those churches planted and revitalized and people discipled, then great, let's do that. So that's some of the things that we've done and talked about. And I think another one just that's really helped us think about it is how to build partnerships. There's quite an interesting section where we talk about how do we want to build partnerships? Like, what are the core things you need for good partnerships? And most the missionaries and the Japanese pastors generally kind of agreed, like, oh yeah, we need these different 5 dimensions of kind of a healthy relationship in place. But what was significant is that the order that they want to put them in place was quite different. So generally, missionaries were saying, hey, what we want to do is we want to come alongside and we go, what's your vision? What's the work we're going to do together? And then once we've got agreement around that, let's build a trust relationship. Let's get to know each other. Let's develop a shared history. So we were very much kind of task first, whereas our Japanese brothers and sisters, generally most of them are actually saying what we want to do first is, well, let's get to know one another. Let's build a trust relationship. And then once we've got that, we can work out what we can do together. And although, that change of order is pretty significant, because, do you start the conversation with what will we do? Or do you start the conversation with, hey, let's get to know each other and work out how to trust one another? And so I think that's made us reflect on how are we going about building partnerships. And then also when we're sending our workers, we've agreed to start a partnership like OMF and the church, and then we send our first workers there. Actually, our workers themselves, when they go in, need to be less about the task, certainly early on, but much more about how do we build the relationship, and then the task comes. That can be challenging. Some of our workers, sent from different contexts. Look, you're sent to do a task, is the question they're being asked. Are you doing that task?
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, no, I'm not right now because I'm building the relationship. Well, we're not funding you to do that. We're funding you to do the task. And so, some tensions come in there and we need to understand each other. But I think learning to build partnership in a way which our partners appreciate and works for them has been an important thing for us to think about.
Yeah, that is interesting because there is so much of a relationship with our home churches and our sending churches, right? That often want to be good stewards of their tithe money, which supports missionaries, and that may result in pressures for the missionaries to work more quickly than maybe Japanese pastors are comfortable with moving forward before those relationships are built. Some of the things that you're mentioning, I think, are in chapter 5 of the report, and it's fun because there are a number of little bar graphs, and when you look at the differences between the Japanese pastor respondents and the missionary respondents, there are pretty stark differences all the way across the board on these graphs. So if if the listener can download the report, then you might have fun with that as well.
Yeah.
Chris, if you have any concluding thoughts, or just you may have just gone over those, but if anything else that you'd like to recommend for our listeners from this
Mm,
report, or anything that I missed that you'd like to talk about from the report, yeah, go for it.
yeah. Thank you. I mean, I think we're just really excited if people download the report. We've made it available for free. If you want a copy of the report, you can find a way to contact us. We can probably provide you with a paper copy. But we're just really excited if people are accessing it and using it and discussing it, and we're wanting to keep learning together. I think that learning posture and the fact that we've been through a lot of discussions as a fellowship has helped us. But then how do we keep that going? It's not like, okay, now we've worked it all out. It's like, no, okay, we've got this, but then there's stuff we need to keep working through. I think I was excited to see that the desire to see church planting, because that feels like a hard conversation to have in the context of so many churches declining.
Mm.
So that was really encouraging to me. But there's also some helpful kind of questions. Well, what do we do about church revitalization that comes out in some of the discussion?
Mhm.
And then I think just this, actually, pastors and missionaries do generally really want to work well together and have a good, working relationship. And hopefully just this exposes some stuff that enables us to kind of be thinking ahead of some of the challenges that can come in, and how to overcome them. Um, yeah, those would be my things. Yeah, please use the report, and we'd love to engage with people as they're learning and getting different insights, and hearing from people. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for the chance to talk about it.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, and thanks for putting this out. I mean, I know that it's not necessarily like you did this by yourself, but I think this is a really great report that seems like a number of things though OMF has put out over the years that are really useful for like the entire missionary community. Like I mean, just for example, some of the old language learning resources that so many missionaries take advantage of that OMF provided. But this is, I think, another resource that you guys have put out that the whole missionary community can benefit from. So thank you for your work on this. And
Yeah, pleasure. Yeah, thank you. Yes, thanks for giving me the chance to share it. It's great to be able
yeah,
to do that. Yeah.
all right. And everyone, thank you for listening.